All right, Cheshi Young with front row seats there in Busan at a concert for the new year. And now we're joined by two Arirang reporters in the studio to help us look back at the year in news. To your right, we have our parliamentary correspondent, Minji, and to your left, our foreign affairs correspondent, Lee-Ji-won. Both of whom were on the ground covering the stories that made headlines this year.
And Minji, I want to start with you as we were coming on the air tonight and recap the past 12 months of this year, the year 2018. You were also covering yet another big story at the National Assembly on the last day of the year, a busy New Year's Eve day there.
That's right. It was an extremely packed year and a very busy last day of the year as well. Today, in fact, one of the top stories was the grilling of senior officials of the Moon administration at the National Assembly for allegedly ordering the illegal surveillance of civilians.
And that was a surprising headline because that's the kind of thing that we saw under the previous Park Geun-hye administration, one of the sort of crimes that brought it down. How did this come about?
You're absolutely right. But here the scandal exploded when a special inspector from the prosecution claimed he illegally gathered information on civilians while working for the presidential office. Now, in Parliament, answering questions today were President Moon Jae-in's chief of staff and his senior secretary for civil affairs, who denied all the allegations. They said no surveillance whatsoever has taken place under the Moon administration, and a probe is currently underway on the matter.
New Year's Eve, but lawmakers questioning them all day. I think it's still going on right now.
But let's get right to it. We've collected some hot stories that took the headlines throughout the year. Of course, the headlines of the year also marking with a lot of these string of summits with big, high-profile key players.
Right, that's right. Let me pull this list of Arirang's top 10 domestic news of the year. Now, among them, we've had 3 inter-Korean summits this year alone. The K-pop boy band BTS claiming worldwide fame, the June local elections in South Korea, which saw a massive win for the ruling party and a devastating loss for the opposition, and the Me Too movement also hit Korea early this year. Also topping headlines were climate issues, from worsening fine dust levels to severe heat wave.
Well, as for the top global stories of the year, we obviously had the first ever summit between the leaders of North Korea and the U.S. And over in Europe, Brexit struggles continued to top headlines. The assassination of Saudi Arabian journalist Jamal Khashoggi also drew condemnation worldwide as a flagrant violation of human rights by the Saudi government. And last but not the least, Arirang's final pick was the major development in space exploration, where NASA's spacecraft revealed the first sound recording from Mars.
But let's go into some of the details of the headlines that we just looked through. I mean, perhaps starting with one that may have started as the local and domestic news, the inter-Korean relations, which eventually evolved to an international news story, multiple summits and even more connections between the two Koreas.
That's right. Inter-Korean relations this year were nothing like we've seen in the past. If you call back to 2017, we had multiple missile tests and even a rocket launch from North Korea. But this year, it was more about fostering peace on the peninsula.
Yeah, really the starting point, you might say, was the Pyeongchang Winter Olympics. And that's when the two Koreas competed together as one team, walked into the stadium together as one.
That's right. So after the two sides competed as one under the unification flag, it was the start of a thaw in relations, bringing the leaders of the two Koreas together for the first time in 11 years. Now, the first encounter of the two leaders at the demarcation line back in April was definitely one to watch, and I was also given the opportunity to live stream that at the press center. And they had another one also at the border village, that time on the northern side, in just a month. The backdrop of that meeting came out of concern that the planned summit between Pyongyang and Washington could be called off, and to the third inter-Korean summit taking place in September in Pyongyang. Now, the summits also produced 2 joint statements, the Panmunjom Declaration and the Pyongyang Declaration. Those were able to lay the groundwork for ridding the peninsula of military tensions and were a stepping stone to fostering economic cooperation between the two sides and eventually a nuclear-free peninsula.
I mean, talk about a string of summits happening in 1 year, but we were this close of getting another inter-Korean summit this year before the year's end, because as the leaders had promised back in September, they were supposed to host North Korean leader Kim Jong-un in Seoul for their 4th summit of the year.
That's right. So after weeks of will he or won't we, the visit never happened, but there's still hope that he might come soon. In a surprise letter to Moon yesterday, Kim expressed disappointment that he couldn't make his promised trip to Seoul by the year's end, but emphasized that he would like to meet again with President Moon frequently in the new year while working to build peace in the region.
Well, there's a lot to look forward to in the coming year. Some of it's already scheduled, like the joint recovery of war remains from the Korean War that the two Koreas are supposed to do in the early part of the year. There's another big player in North Korea diplomacy, though, and that's the U.S. And talks between those two seem to have sort of slowed down, lost some momentum here towards the end of the year.
That's right. I'm sure Ji-won would like to talk about that, seeing as she was there.
Yes, Minji. Well, remember last year when it was all fire and fury with nuclear buttons on desks and these harsh rhetorics exchanged between the leaders of North Korea and the U.S.? Well, this year, the two leaders decided to make new history, and despite the obstacles along the way, they became the first leaders of their states to meet. Now, Kim and Trump had their first historic meetup in Singapore on June 12th, and I luckily got the chance to cover the event at the site, as you can see on the footage there. And so the leaders shook hands on 4 points, including the establishment of diplomatic relations in exchange for the North's denuclearization. Now, there was progress before and after the summit. The regime blew up its nuclear test site at Punggye in a show of scrapping its nuclear power, and North Korea also returned 3 detained Korean Americans back to the U.S. and sent back the remains of the American war deads. But that patching things up period didn't last long, and the relations between the two sides seem to have cooled down a bit as the talks on the North's denuclearization waned over the past couple months. Now, come New Year, it looks as though we could expect some more development between the two. For one, since President Trump said he looks forward to holding his next summit with Kim sometime early next year. So that big moment between Kim and Trump is something that we can surely look forward to next year.
But Ji-won, shifting focus a little from the North Korea-related diplomacy, things got a little off shaky with Korea's neighbor, Japan. Quite a different story between the two sides, both Seoul and Tokyo, with the two countries, two closely aligned countries, making things much complicated and difficult, especially towards the latter part of the year.
Yes, well, Minji will cover that diplomatic news for us as well.
So yes, historical issues have long been difficult for the two, and their bilateral ties strained further this year. And one of the issues, again, is the comfort woman issue during World War II. Now, Seoul decided to dissolve a foundation funded by Tokyo to compensate the South Korean victims. We also saw a Seoul court rule that 2 Japanese companies compensate South Koreans who were forced to work without pay during Japan's colonial rule of Korea. Now, both decisions drew immediate condemnation from Japan, which called for responsible action on Seoul's part. So the two will have to face the difficult task of improving relations in the new year.
Right, and apart from that, Ji-won, the so-called G2 are going through a rough patch, to say the least.
Yes, you're right, Devin. The U.S. and China also have some work to do. Their trade war went into full swing early this year, with the U.S. imposing new tariffs on steel and aluminum, targeting China especially. The two sides have currently stopped adding new tariffs on each other, and they have been working to resolve the conflict as agreed by their leaders at the G20. Now, the U.S. negotiating delegates are to visit Beijing early next month to hammer out a deal on trade. So let's hope that this potentially disastrous war can come to an end without further collateral damage.
Right, so we've got through some of the hard news of the year, but we also had a dramatic and even inspirational story coming out of Southeast Asia.
Yes, Devin. While all these countries were fighting for their interest in these different matters, there was one story that brought the whole world together. And that was when one day in late June, a youth football team comprised of 12 boys aged between 11 and 16, and their 25-year-old coach got lost in Thailand. The search went on for days, but there was no sign of them.
Right, I remember international media covering that story from day to day on each and every development taking place in that cave.
You're right, Semin. Everyone was wishing for the boys' safe return. And finally, after a 10-day search, the boys were found trapped deep inside a cave due to heavy monsoon rain. They were rescued after being stranded for 17 days, and though the boys and their coach were rescued safe and healthy, a diver died due to a lack of oxygen during the rescue operation. Now, this miraculous rescue and the sacrifices made by the rescuers really amazed and inspired the world. The boys received invitations from all around the world, like getting to watch their favorite team, Manchester United, at their home stadium.
And now, while we are on the soft news, we cannot miss this one. We've talked about it towards the first part of the show today. Yes, the mega hit cultural K-pop seeming to have reached yet another pinnacle. I mean, the BTS, Faith.
That's right. So the Korean boy band BTS showed that Hallyu has no boundaries. Just to tell you about some of the key achievements they made this year, BTS had 2 #1 albums on the Billboard 200. This was the first time a K-pop album topped the U.S. chart and the first time in 12 years that an album in a foreign language achieved such a feat.
Well, they even made the cover of Time. That's pretty impressive as well.
That's right. The magazine referred to them as the most popular boy band in the world and even compared their concerts to those of the Beatles. The group also became the first ever K-pop artist to address the UN. The band's leader delivered a speech at the UN General Assembly and encouraged people to love themselves as they are, as is the theme of the group's Love Yourself albums. Now, their increased popularity has also been a boon for the Korean economy, attracting foreign tourists to the country and boosting exports of Korean goods, which also shows the strong potential of Hallyu.
One thing that I regret about this year is not having to cover the idea and the story of BTS myself.
Not getting to cover. Well, there's always news to cover. Maybe that's something you can look forward to in the new year. We can always hope.
I am very looking forward to that.
Well, Minji and Jiwon, thank you very much for tonight, and Happy New Year.
Happy New Year, guys.
Happy New Year,
Happy New Year.